Okay, well, welcome everybody to this Bible study on prayer. We're going to be looking at some of the teachings of Jesus on prayer, specifically found in Luke 11. We're going to take this passage over a number of sessions, just breaking it down. And in this one, we're going to provide an introduction to prayer and to the Gospel of Luke as well as looking at the first verse in the passage, Luke chapter 11, verse 1. So let's go ahead and read the verse, and then we'll make some comments and have a conversation about it afterwards. We pray this really blesses you. So Luke chapter 11, verse 1. One day, Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples." And so, Laulu, Pastor Fraser, in this series, we're going to be touching on prayer and all about what it is, what Jesus says about it. And Pastor Fraser, I'll come to you first for this. Can we just begin with stating what is prayer and also what is it not?
Okay, great question. I mean, prayer in its simplest form would be talking to God, but it's so much more than that. It's us having a conversation with God. It's a two-way street, isn't it? It's us talking to God and us hearing from God. Prayer is a daily doorway into the life of God, and really it's about deepening our relationship with God. Now, what prayer isn't, and I guess there's kind of almost two kind of flawed approaches that we can take when it comes to prayer, is there's number one, it's just about us asking. And then there's the other kind of extreme of that where it's like, oh, what's the point in asking? Because, you know, if God's going to accomplish his will, well, there's no point in praying. So like, there's no point. Like we kind of just, I guess, come into this like religious fatalism where it's like, oh, God's going to do what he wants to do. So what's the point in me praying? And I think the answer's somewhere in between. So the challenge with the first one is that God's just going to give me everything I ask. And I just need, you know, and there's different people who'll tell you, you know, you just need more faith and you've just got to ask. And, you know, you just confess it and possess it, blab it and grab it. That kind of teaching can be really harmful to our prayer life, because actually prayer is not necessarily about me changing God, me getting stuff from God, but actually it's about me coming into alignment with God. That's what relationship's about, right? Prayer is about deepening my relationship with God, which kind of comes to the next one. Like, what's the point in praying? Well, prayer opens the doorway into God's, like, for God to really work in my life, for me to come into alignment with his will and really be everything that he's called me to be, do everything that he's called us to do, and grow deeper in that relationship. And it's a beautiful, wonderful privilege, I think, prayer is. That kind of covers what you've...
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful opening to what prayer is. And you've covered on a number of themes there. It's a conversation. It's not controlling God, but it's also not useless. It is actually incredibly useful. It's one of the most productive things that we can do as believers. Laulu, anything to add there? What would you say? What is prayer? What is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Because prayer is, you know, communication with God, but it's not just like a, you know, one-off communication with God. This is bred out of a relationship with him. And I mean, Pastor Fraser, I think, hit the nail on the head there, that, you know, there's two different approaches that people have to it, where, you know, the first one is called, you know, the word of faith teaching, where people believe, oh yeah, well, I have all the unlimited blessings in the world, and almost like prayer is a magic wishing well, and once I ask for anything that I want in the way that I want it, that it should then appear in exactly the way that I've asked for it. But that's not what prayer is. Again, people, you know, misunderstand the point of prayer, and I think that's the important thing. It's like, what's prayer to you? And again, I think having that understanding that it's about relationship kind of then breeds how we then see it and how we then approach it. It's not about getting exactly what we want, how we want it. Actually, it's about aligning ourselves with God's will. And that's why, you know, throughout this teaching, we'll be seeing how prayer isn't just about our will, but actually it's about, you know, aligning what we say, it's aligning our minds and aligning our hearts with God's will as well. So no, I really think, Pastor Fraser, you hit the nail on the head there. And yeah, it's not really about, you know, on the other extreme, then having a passive approach and thinking, well, everything's already, you know, set in stone, so I don't need to approach God in prayer. And I then kind of view as like a religious kind of study, but actually it's not just something that you do every morning to tick a box. Actually, there is power in prayer. So I think that's really important to note.
I think that's really, really, really helpful. Sorry, Pastor Fraser, go on.
No, it's okay. I just loved what Laulu was saying there, especially on that kind of like the first challenging one, because actually God knows what we need better than we do often. And I'm just thinking about even like I've got a little girl and she'll like, this morning she was like asking for an ice lolly for breakfast. And I'm like, no way. Like I know it's what she wants and she thinks that's going to be the best for her.
Yeah.
But it's not what's best for her. She needs porridge and a banana and it's kind of boring.
Yeah.
But that's going to set her up. She can have an ice lolly in the evening after she's had her evening meal. But it's like actually, no, sugar for breakfast is not helpful. And I think sometimes that's how we come in prayer. We don't realize it because we think we know what's best, but actually God kind of sits above it all and he knows what's best in the long term. And there's a beautiful verse in Romans 8, isn't it? That he's working all things together for the good of those who love him. And that's, specifically talking into the context of persecution and challenging times. So actually prayer is definitely about us trusting in God and really believing that he's going to, work those things together.
I think that's brilliant. That's really helpful. And I think, throughout this study, we're going to touch even more on answered prayer and unanswered prayer as well. So do stay tuned for the rest of this series. We're really going to get into it. But so much of what you guys have said is really helpful. It reminds me of a phrase I once heard, which is that prayer changes things, mostly me. Because it is true that prayer changes things. In the Bible, we see when ordinary pray, extraordinary things happen. Through the Old Testament, you think of Elijah, man of faith, prayed, and it doesn't rain for a period of time, prays again, and it rains again. You think of people in the New Testament praying and healings happening. But then you also see throughout, people praying for strength to do what God's called them to, praying for grace and favor to be able to accomplish the tasks that God sets before them. So it's both in the extraordinary and in the ordinary. Prayer has tremendous power to help us in our lives of faith. So, okay, that's brilliant. So that's what prayer is. Some things about what it isn't. We could do a whole episode on just that, I'm sure. But let's touch on the context of Luke. That's the book that we're going to be studying, specifically Luke chapter 11, that little passage there. Laulu, what do we know about the book of Luke that can help us as we're reading through these passages? Some of the context, who's the author, audience, any comments on the reasons it was written?
Yeah, of course. And, Luke was, of course, one of the followers of Jesus. He was someone who we see later on that, he goes on, missions with Paul and, and the likes. And I think what's really important to note is that it's almost like Luke is, well, you can almost view it like the book of Luke and Acts, almost like as a two-parter. Right. So it's almost like they lead very directly into each other. But then the way Luke addresses his approach, of course, is one of the four Gospels. Of course, the way he approaches his gospel while writing it is not to seem like some really impressive writer, but actually, Luke writes this book to the common person. He writes it in simple terms so that the common man or woman will be able to understand what he says. So he makes things simple. He makes it as clear as possible. Of course, back in the day, the Jews were God's chosen people, but then also he's addressing the Gentiles who weren't I guess as
that's essentially non-Jews.
Yeah, non-Jews. Yeah, people who weren't didn't know big terms or things like that. But basically, he's addressing these guys, and he's basically doing this so that he would really approach this in a sense where he's writing it to the common person and to everyone who is able to, I guess, hear the words that he's writing.
That's brilliant. That's really helpful. Anything to add, Pastor Fraser?
Yeah, I look at the Gospel of Luke kind of like, I think he's like the Louis Theroux. And I was saying what I mean, Louis Theroux, the documentary maker, Luke goes around and he's interviewing everyone. He's interviewing eyewitnesses. He's gathering all this information. He takes years to gather all this information. He sorts out the details. You can see this in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. So I think he's a bit like Louis Theroux in the fact that he gets all this evidence, all this different stuff. So Acts is probably more narrative that he's involved in that kind of stuff, especially the missions with Paul and things. But especially the gospel, he's gathering all of this information and he's really writing to convince a guy called Theophilus, who is a Greek guy, non-Jewish, as Laulu said, on the reliability of the story of Jesus, or on why Jesus is who he said he is. And Luke's a doctor, he's academic, he's very informative, but just like Laulu said, the first 4 sentences that we read is one sentence in Greek, and that's kind of really polished, kind of high academic language. But the rest of the Gospel of Luke is really, it's universal, I guess. Anyone can read it. It's really easy to understand. It's written kind of in the common the common language of the people so that people can understand. Luke's it's a wonderful gospel. It highlights different things than Matthew and Mark and even John. It really majors on prayer.
Yeah.
I think prayer, the 9 recorded prayers of Jesus in Luke and 10 recorded teachings of prayer that Jesus taught in Luke. So it's a book that really majors on prayer, which is wonderful for our little, which is why we're kind of bringing out this theme of prayer in Luke chapter 11, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you can see that prayer, based off of what you've just said there, those statistics, you can see that it was something that was close to Luke's heart in itself, given that Matthew and Mark, the other gospels that are similarly structured to Luke, they mention prayer just a couple of times. It's not that it's not important to them, but you can see it's near and dear to Luke's heart. Fascinating stuff. One thing that is also interesting to note about Luke is that he himself, scholars reckon that he is himself a converted Gentile, somebody who wasn't a Jew himself. So you kind of wonder if maybe that was one of the reasons prayer held a close part in, was close to his heart in terms of, wow, like we have this privilege of coming to God in prayer. And I love that. I think that's such a brilliant attitude to come to prayer with as a real privilege. Okay, so let's get into this verse then. Luke 11 verse 1, it reads, one day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples. So that word disciples comes up a couple of times there. Lauda, what does that mean? What, and why is prayer an important part of our discipleship today?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, a disciple quite simply means a follower. So, the disciples of Jesus, these were the followers of Jesus. We see this used multiple times in the Bible, and I guess there's sometimes, a mix up between, like the chosen 12 disciples and I guess the general word disciples as well. And I guess that there were the chosen 12 when Jesus was starting his ministry that he chose. But then there's also just the general followers of Jesus. I mean, we even see in the chapter before this that Jesus sends out 72 disciples to, go out on a mission. But, a disciple means a follower of Jesus. So as, Christians, we are disciples. We are followers of Jesus. And really, as disciples, it's important to communicate, because in any sort of relationship, in any sort of, whether two-way, three-way a relationship, it's important to communicate. So actually, if we are disciples, it's important, to speak and to, ask for these things that, we've been saying. But then also as disciples, it's important to listen as well. So that's why prayer is such an important part of discipleship, because again, it's prayer is a two-way street. It's about speaking, it's also about listening, and
that's brilliant.
I think that's really important for us as disciples.
That's brilliant. I suppose the thing with disciples as well is that you would learn from both the explicit teachings of the master, as it were, but you'd also learn just by, as you've said, following them, seeing how they live their life. And one of the things about Jesus is he doesn't just teach about prayer, but he prays himself, right? So Pastor Fraser, what do we know about the prayer life of Jesus?
Yeah, well, we can see throughout the Gospels that Jesus, one day when Jesus was praying, so you can only imagine like the disciples looking at the intimacy that Jesus prayed to the Father with, and it kind of comes back again to the context of Luke, that Luke really majors on this theme of Jesus being, so Jesus is fully God, but he's also fully man.
Right.
You see the phrase constantly throughout the book of Luke that Jesus is the Son of Man, and if Jesus prays, like how much more do we need to pray? And kind of, you see Jesus's prayer life is powerful, it's passionate. You see all these moments when Jesus prays, he prays at his baptism, he prays after a day of working miracles, he prays, this is all in the Gospel of Luke, he prays before choosing the 12 disciples, he spends all night in prayer before he does that. Before Peter's confession of faith and the first prediction of the Passion, Jesus prays alone. Jesus goes to the Mount of Transfiguration to pray, he prays with thanksgiving and gladness after the mission of the 70. His example leads the disciples in this verse to teach him how to pray. Jesus prays in agony on the Mount of Olives, and Jesus obviously prays during his crucifixion. So Jesus' prayer life is consistent. He prays continually. He prays passionately. He prays with intimacy to the Father. And then it kind of, as you said, like discipleship is showing us that we can be like Jesus. And I think that's kind of what the Gospel of Luke really majors in as well, is that if Jesus can do it, we can do it. And actually it's inspirational. It's a real life for us to look up to and try and be like. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you definitely think, don't you, if it was important for Jesus to pray, then how much more for us?
Yeah.
Is it important for us to pray louder? What other lessons can we learn from Jesus' prayer life?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one key point, even on this verse that we see when it starts off saying that one day Jesus was praying, and, I think it says after that when he finished. So I think what that strikes really importantly to me is that actually it was such a priority in his life that his disciples even had to wait for him to finish his prayer for them to even approach him. So again, it's like prayer, I mean, Pastor Fraser and you yourself, Pastor John, have shared loads of examples of Jesus praying. This was an example for us today as disciples of him to actually follow in those footsteps, but then also to make prayer a priority, not just something that we do, on the sidelines, but then actually, if Jesus wouldn't allow his prayers to be interrupted, I think that's an example for us to make sure that, in our prayer life, that we make it a priority. And, like Jesus, because he approached prayer and he, prayed to God as, the Father, that we can have that intimacy as well in our prayer life. So again, I think to make sure it's consistent, to make sure it's, it's intimate with our Father in heaven, and to make sure that it's a priority is really important.
And if I could just jump off the back of that as well, it's super practical. Like Lalu was saying, like one day when Jesus was praying, like one day, so like you need a time. And I think someone said it like this: there's another verse. I can't remember the scripture, but there's another verse that says early in the morning Jesus went to pray. Like you need you need a time to pray and a place to pray. Like of course we pray continually, but like a place to pray. Like he was in a certain place. Like Jesus went somewhere to pray, and I find it helpful. Like for myself, I just like going on prayer walks. It's something that's helpful for me. So like a place to pray and a time to pray, because I think if you don't put some time to pray, it's really easy to just get caught up in the busyness of the day and get to the end of the day and be like, oh my gosh, do you know what I mean? And I think who said it? Prayer to the believer is like oxygen to the human being. Like we need to be constantly in prayer as well. So yeah, kind of the two tensions together. Yeah.
And I think, that's so helpful in terms of overcoming that distraction that can so often takes away from prayer and bring it to a place of discipline in our lives, I suppose. So that's that really practical stuff we can learn from Jesus there in terms of our prayer life. The disciples in this verse, they ask Jesus to teach them to pray. So here's my question, Pastor Fraser. If prayer is simply about speaking to God, why do we need to be taught how to do it?
Because we can all get better in our communication. I think in any relationship, probably marriage highlights it hugely for me, is it's really easy for me to just sit and talk Amy's ear off about the things that Amy espresso, we need to do, we need to get this machine, I really want this grinder. And I can get all down into just talking about my stuff. And then when she opens up about her day, I just switch off. That's not good communication. So I need to be taught sometimes through a marriage. We actually do get taught how to have conversation, by our parents when we're growing up. So we get taught how to have conversation with human beings. So definitely we need teaching on how to pray, because actually I don't just want to have an average prayer life. I think that's the heart of the disciples here. They saw Jesus praying. They saw the intimacy. They saw the power. They saw probably the beauty of it and thought, I want that.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to get to that place of passion where it's like, I want a passionate prayer life. I don't just want an average prayer. I want a great prayer life. I want a prayer life that makes a difference for my family. I want a prayer life that makes a difference for my church. I want a prayer life that gets wins in my life, that gets, that really helps, me live for God and all those kinds of things. So I think actually teaching on prayer is really important. And then prayer is really practical as well. I love how they don't say Jesus teaches how to pray, but teaches to pray. So if we're not we can listen, we can study this and you guys can listen to all the series on this, but like if you don't take anything else away from this, go pray. Prayer is a practice. It's not just a theory. And actually it's really important that we start praying. But good teaching will help your prayer life go from good to great. It'll help it. Even studying from this, I know we were speaking in the car on the way over to filming this. Like actually we've been really challenged in our prayer life, kind of really fired up just from really getting into this. So actually studying what true prayer is, what Jesus says about prayer, it helps elevate it to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's really important what you said about, like the disciples, they didn't ask Jesus, teach us how to pray. They asked us, teach us to pray, because the intention or the end goal isn't the structure. That's actually what's going to drive us to the end goal. And I think that's, it's really important that, the disciples, like us, we should have that approach. How do we pray? How do we better, our relationship with God? How do we, better communicate with him? How do we better listen to him? And I think, just having that, I guess, mindset that actually that the end goal isn't the structure. And I think the structure is so important. And that's why Jesus has set this out for us. But actually we aren't approaching this verse and reading this chapter thinking, okay, like the structure is what I'm looking for. No, that that's what's going to help us to then further our relationship with God. And I think, for us to pray more and more and more, because it's important to not be repetitive in prayer, but actually to pray repeatedly and to keep on praying. And I think that's what's really important here, to, not to chase after the structure, but then actually to use the structure to chase after God.
Wait, say that again.
It's really helpful.
So not to chase after the structure. But
the repetitive.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. So basically that we shouldn't pray repetitively. Oh, no. We should pray.
Don't pray repetitively, but pray
repeatedly.
Yeah. Do not pray repetitively, but pray repeatedly.
That's brilliant.
Beautiful.
That's brilliant. That's really, really, really helpful. And I suppose, when we're talking about coming back to Jesus' teaching on prayer there, I suppose it's one of those reasons why obviously these disciples, they're coming to Jesus to learn. But even for us today, whether we've been a Christian for a few weeks or a Christian for many, many years, it's always helpful, isn't it, to come back to what Jesus says about prayer. Somebody said that prayer is so simple that the smallest child can pray, but it is so great that the mightiest man or woman of God cannot be said to have truly mastered prayer. So it's so helpful to come back to what Jesus says about prayer, be challenged to pray with more expectation, more consistency, more boldness, more faith, and then we'll come away, with a fresher prayer life, a more intimate prayer life, and maybe even get our prayers answered as well. So we really hope that you've enjoyed this first episode in this series about prayer. Do join us next time for episode number 2, as we'll be continuing on this theme further.
Yeah.